The tomb was built for two. This was the thing people did not say. That the tomb beneath the Goldenmere stronghold, the tomb where Heloise Soulweaver was buried, had been designed with two alcoves. One was occupied, one was empty. The empty alcove was the Alpha King's, reserved for the day he joined his wife in the stone and the silence, and the reservation was not institutional. It was personal, made by a man who had decided at 27 that the space beside his dead wife was the only future he intended to occupy. Edric Soulweaver had been 27 when Heloise died. He was 34 now. 7 years. The 7 years had been governance, effective, disciplined, the specific quality of a king who had channeled everything he possessed into the territory's function, because the alternative to channeling was feeling, and feeling was a thing he had locked in the tomb along with the woman it belonged to. The court understood. The court had watched the locking happen. The specific incremental process of a man removing the parts of himself that had been connected to Heloise and placing them in the stone room beneath the stronghold, where no one went except Edric, who went every Sunday, who descended the stairs alone and remained for 1 hour, and who returned with the particular quality of a man who had visited something and found the visiting sufficient to sustain him until the next visit. The court did not discuss this. The court managed around it, scheduling around the Sunday hour, advising around the specific emotional territory that was off limits, governing around a king who was excellent at governance and absent at everything else. 7 years was a long time to sustain an absence. Edric was beginning to understand this, not because the absence was failing, the absence was functional, had been functional, would continue to be functional, because the absence was becoming the identity rather than the response, and the difference between the two was the difference between a man who had lost something and a man who had become the losing. He did not know how to stop becoming it. He was not looking for someone to show him. Someone showed him anyway. Chapter 1. The Festival of Long Night was the Goldenmere territory's oldest tradition. 3 days of midwinter celebration that predated the Soulweaver line and that the territory maintained with the specific reverence of a community that found, in the darkest part of the year, the reason to make the most noise. Edric attended the festival because the festival required his attendance, and because the attendance was governance, and governance was the thing he could still do. He stood on the hall's platform at the festival's opening, and he delivered the traditional address, and he performed the specific role that the tradition assigned to the king. The welcoming, the toasting, the particular ceremonial function of a man who represented the territory's continuity. He performed it well. He always performed it well. Performance was the specific skill he had developed in 7 years of locking the real thing in a tomb and presenting the performance in its place. The festival's entertainment was organized by the Cultural Commission, music, storytelling, the specific arts that the Goldenmere territory produced and that the Long Night Festival showcased. Edric did not typically attend the entertainment. He attended the ceremony and the diplomatic functions, and then he withdrew, because withdrawal was his method and the method was functional. On the second night, he did not withdraw. The reason was not intentional. The reason was architectural. The corridor he used to exit the hall was blocked by a structural repair that the maintenance steward had scheduled, without consulting the king's exit route, and the alternative corridor passed through the hall's side gallery, which was where the evening's musicians were performing. He was passing through. He was not stopping. He stopped. The voice reached him before he entered the gallery, the specific quality of a sound that carried through stone corridors, with the particular resonance of something that was not being projected, but was simply large, the way some voices were large regardless of their volume. The volume was not loud. The voice was immense. He stood in the corridor and he listened, and the listening did something to the specific interior architecture that he had spent 7 years maintaining, the locked doors, the sealed chambers, the particular arrangement of a man's emotional structure around a central absence. The voice did not open the doors. The voice made the doors aware they were closed. He entered the gallery. Chapter 2. She was standing in the performance space, the specific area at the gallery's center where the festival's musicians performed for the crowd that gathered on the gallery's seating. The crowd was perhaps 60 people. The particular audience that midwinter festival entertainment attracted. People who had come for the music, who valued the music, who found in the darkest night's longest hours the specific reason to sit in a room and listen to someone sing. She was not what he expected a voice that size to belong to. She was slight, compact, the specific physical economy of a body that did not announce itself, that occupied its space without expanding into the space around it. Dark-haired, young, mid-20s, he estimated, with the particular stillness of a performer who did not move when she sang because the singing was the movement and the body was simply the thing the singing came from. She was singing in Old Galdenmere, the territory's pre-trade dialect, the specific language that the oldest songs used and that most modern wolves understood partially and felt completely. The song was one he recognized. A lament, the particular form that the Old Galdenmere tradition used for grief, the specific musical structure that had been designed, over centuries, to hold the weight of loss in sound so that the person carrying the loss could set it down for the duration of the song. He stood at the gallery's entrance and he listened to a woman he had never seen sing a grief song in a dead language, and he felt the specific thing that 7 years of absence had been designed to prevent. The doors, the sealed chambers, the central absence, all of it responding to the sound the way that locked things responded to the correct key. Not opening, recognizing that the key existed. The song ended. The gallery applauded. She acknowledged the applause with the minimal gesture of a performer whose relationship was with the song rather than the audience. She began another song. Not a lament, something else. Something he did not recognize, in the same Old Galdenmere but with a different structure. This one was, he searched for the word, and the word was not available because the vocabulary he used for music was the vocabulary of a man who had stopped listening to music 7 years ago. The word, when he found it, was warmth. The song was warm the way the lament had been heavy. Completely, structurally, the specific quality of a sound that communicated its content through its architecture, rather than through its lyrics. He stood in the gallery entrance for 3 songs. He did not sit. He did not move into the room. He stood at the threshold between the corridor and the music, and the threshold was the specific geographic representation of the thing he had been standing at for 7 years. The boundary between the locked interior and everything that was outside it. She saw him, not during the songs, between them, in the specific pause that separated one song from the next. She looked up and her eyes found him in the doorway, and the finding was the particular quality of a musician seeing someone in their audience who was not there for the entertainment, someone who was standing at a threshold with the expression of a man who had heard something that he recognized, and who did not know what to do with the recognition. She held his gaze for approximately 2 seconds. Then she began the next song. Chapter 3. Her name was Tova Gren. He learned this from the Cultural Commission's program, which he obtained from Cyrus, his steward, with the specific casual request that fooled neither of them. The singer, Cyrus said, from the 2nd evening. The program lists the performers, Edric said. I am reviewing the program. You have not reviewed the festival program in 7 years, Cyrus said, with the particular directness of a steward who had been managing this king for the entirety of the 7 years, and who had developed the professional capacity to be honest when honesty was required. I am reviewing it now, Edric said. Cyrus provided the information without further commentary, which was itself commentary. Tova Gren, 25, from the Galdenmere Eastern District, trained in the traditional vocal arts by her grandmother, who had been one of the territory's last practitioners of the Old Galdenmere singing tradition, the specific vocal lineage that had maintained the old songs through oral transmission across generations, and that was, by the Cultural Commission's assessment, critically endangered. She was the last one, the last practitioner of the tradition. The grandmother had died 2 years ago, and the tradition's survival now rested entirely on a 25-year-old woman from the Eastern District whose voice was immense, and whose audience at a midwinter festival in a side gallery was 60 people. Edric read this. He read it with the specific attention of a man whose governance skills were excellent, and who was now applying those skills to a thing that was not governance, but that he was processing through the governance framework, because the governance framework was the only framework he had. He went to the 3rd evening's performance, not in the doorway this time, in the gallery, in the seating, in the specific position of a man who had decided to cross the threshold and sit in the room where the music was. He sat in the back row, which was the specific compromise between being present and being invisible that his current emotional capacity could accommodate. She sang, the same voice, the same immensity, the same specific quality of sound that made locked doors aware they were closed. She sang the old songs, laments and warmth songs, and a specific form he had not heard before, which the program described as a soul song. The particular Old Galdenmere tradition of a song that was not about grief or joy, but about the specific state of a person's interior, rendered in sound, offered to the room as evidence rather than performance. The soul song she sang was, "He did not have the language. He had not had the language for 7 years. The language of describing what music did to the inside of a person was a language that required the inside to be accessible, and his inside had been locked in a tomb, and the key had been his dead wife, and the key did not exist anymore. Except the voice was doing something to the lock. Not opening it, he was not that simple, and the lock was not that fragile. The voice was doing the thing that sustained sound did to physical structures, vibrating, the specific resonant frequency that could, if the frequency matched the structure, produce movement in things that had been still for a very long time. He sat in the back row and he felt the vibration and he did not leave. After the performance, she found him. Not the other way around. She came to the back row where he was still sitting while the gallery emptied around him, and she stood in front of him with the particular composure of a woman who had seen a man standing in a doorway with a locked expression, and who had now found the same man sitting in a back row with the locked expression slightly less locked. "You were in the doorway last night," she said. "Yes. You're in the room tonight." The specific assessment of a performer reading an audience member. Not the political assessment of someone recognizing a king, but the artistic assessment of someone reading the effect their work had produced. "The lament," she said. "Last night, you recognized it." "I recognized the form," he said, "not the specific song." "The form is for grief," she said. "The old Galdenmere lament tradition structures grief in sound so that the person holding the grief can set it down for the song's duration." "I know what the form does," he said. "You know because you are carrying what the form is designed for," she said. The gallery was empty now. The two of them, the king in the back row and the singer standing in front of him, occupied the space and the specific quality of a conversation that had moved, in 4 exchanges, from the social to the personal with the velocity that honesty produced when both people in the conversation were operating on it. "I am carrying something," he said. "The something is not available for discussion." "The something does not need to be discussed," she said. "The something needs to be heard." At the slight frame and the dark hair and the specific quality of a woman whose voice was immense and whose presence was quiet and whose observation of him was accurate in the way that art was accurate. Not precise, but true. "Heard," he repeated. "The lament form works because the sound holds the grief," she said. "Not the words, the sound, the specific frequencies and the specific structure. The grief transfers from the person to the sound, and the sound holds it for the duration, and then the sound ends and the grief returns, but the person has had the duration of the song where the weight was somewhere else." She looked at the empty gallery. "You have not had that. You have been carrying it without setting it down." "I set it down," he said, "in a tomb. Every Sunday." She was quiet for a moment. "A tomb is a place," she said. "A song is a time. Places hold things permanently. Songs hold things temporarily. Both are necessary." He looked at the gallery floor. "I am singing tomorrow," she said. "The final evening. I am singing the complete cycle, all 7 lament forms in the traditional sequence. The cycle takes 90 minutes. It is the specific old Galdenmere ritual for sustained grief, the kind that has been carried for years rather than weeks. Sustained grief," he said. "The first form holds the loss. The second holds the anger. The third holds the guilt. The fourth holds the memory. The fifth holds the love that produced the grief. The sixth holds the specific weight of continuing to live after the loss. The seventh," she paused, "the seventh holds the person. Not the grief, the person who has been underneath the grief the entire time." He looked at her. "Come tomorrow," she said. "Sit in the room. The cycle will do what the cycle was designed to do." Chapter 4. He came. The final evening of the Long Night Festival was the territory's largest gathering, 300 wolves in the Great Hall for the closing ceremony, the specific institutional conclusion that the tradition required. The gallery performance was separate, a smaller event, the cultural program's final offering, attended by the specific audience that valued the old arts and that found in the final evening's performance the festival's most meaningful content. The gallery held 80 people. He sat in the back row. She entered the performance space wearing the traditional vocalist's garment, dark, unadorned, the specific costume that the old Galdenmere tradition prescribed for the lament cycle. She stood at the center. She did not speak. The tradition did not include introduction. The song began when the song was ready, and the song's readiness was determined by the singer's assessment of the room's capacity to receive it. She assessed the room. Her eyes moved through the audience, reading, evaluating the particular musician's assessment of a space's acoustic and emotional readiness. Her eyes found him in the back row. She held his gaze. Then she began. The first form, the loss. The sound that the old Galdenmere tradition had designed, over centuries, to hold the specific weight of something gone. The voice filled the gallery the way it had filled the corridor, not through volume but through immensity, the particular quality of a sound that was larger than the space it was in, and that made the space expand to accommodate it. He felt the loss. Not thought about it, felt it. The specific quality of feeling that he had locked in the tomb 7 years ago, the feeling that lived in the stone room beside Heloise's body, the feeling that he visited on Sundays and that he experienced in the controlled environment of a sealed underground chamber where the feeling could not escape. The song held it. The song took the loss from the sealed chamber and held it in sound, and the holding was different from the tomb's holding. The tomb held permanently, the song held temporarily, and the temporary holding had the specific quality of a weight lifted for the duration by someone who was strong enough to hold it. The second form, the anger. He had not known he was angry. The anger had been locked with the rest, sealed in the tomb, processed as governance rather than felt as emotion. The song found it. The song held it. The third, the guilt. The specific guilt of a man who had survived the person he loved. The particular quality of continuing to exist after the existence you had built with someone had ended, and the specific impossible question of whether the continuing was betrayal. The song held it. The fourth, the memory. Heloise. Her face. Her voice. The specific quality of her presence that he had locked in the tomb because the memory was too large to carry in the open, and the tomb was the only space that could contain it. The song held her. Not the memory, her. The specific quality of a person rendered in sound, present in the room the way she had not been present in any room for 7 years. He was crying. He registered this as information rather than as an event, the specific physical response of a body releasing something it had been holding for 7 years. Conducted in the dark of a back row in a gallery where 80 people were listening to a woman sing, and where one of them was coming apart in the specific way that the cycle had been designed to produce. The fifth, the love. The thing that had produced the grief. The specific quality of what he had felt for Heloise, rendered in the old Galdenmere vocal tradition structure, held in the sound of a voice that was immense enough to hold it. He had not felt the love in 7 years. He had locked it with the grief because the love and the grief were the same material, and separating them was not something the tomb could do. The song separated them. The fifth form held the love as something distinct from the grief, not the cause of the pain, but the thing the pain had been built on, the foundation rather than the damage. The song held the love, and the holding showed him the love without the grief, and the showing was the first time in 7 years he had experienced the love without the grief arriving simultaneously. The sixth, the continuation. The specific weight of being alive after loss, the particular ongoing quality of a life that continued, because biology continued and governance continued and the days continued regardless of whether the person living them had consented to the continuation. The seventh form was quiet. After the immensity of the first 6, the loss and the anger and the guilt and the memory and the love and the continuation, the seventh was the specific absence of immensity. The voice reduced. The sound contracted. The specific quality of the seventh form was the sound of a room after a storm. Still, changed, holding the evidence of what had passed through it. The seventh held the person, not the grief, not the loss, not Heloise, him. Edric, the man who had been underneath the grief for 7 years, the man who had locked himself in a tomb that was designed for 2, and who had been living in the empty alcove while the occupied alcove held the woman he had loved, and the full alcove held the feelings he had put there because carrying them was not something he could do, and setting them down was not something anyone had offered him. Until now. The song held him, the specific quality of the seventh form. Quiet, contracted, the sound of the room after the storm, held the man who had been carrying the storm and showed him that the man existed independently of the carrying. The song ended. The gallery was silent. The particular silence that followed the completion of something that had changed the room's composition, not applause silence but processing silence, the specific quality of 80 people absorbing what they had received. He sat in the back row, and the crying had stopped and the carrying had not stopped, but the carrying was different. Lighter was not the right word. Known. The carrying was known. He had felt it. All of it. Loss and anger and guilt and memory and love and continuation. And the feeling had not destroyed him, and the feeling had been held by a voice that was strong enough to hold it. And the holding had shown him that the things he had locked in the tomb could exist outside the tomb. Could exist in sound. Could exist in air. Could exist temporarily, held by someone, and then return to him changed by the holding. The gallery applauded. He did not applaud. He sat in the silence that the song had left. Chapter 5. He found her after the performance. Not in the gallery, in the corridor outside it, the same corridor where he had first heard her voice, the specific architectural space that had been the threshold between his locked interior and the sound that had made the lock aware it was closed. She was standing with a glass of water, the specific practical aftermath of a 90-minute vocal performance, the physical reality of a body that had just produced immensity for an hour and a half, and that required hydration before it required anything else. The cycle, he said. She looked at him. She read his face, the specific evidence of what the cycle had produced, the particular quality of a man who had been crying in a back row for 90 minutes, and who was now standing in a corridor looking like someone who had been taken apart and put back together with the pieces in slightly different positions. It worked, she said. What does working mean, he said. In the tradition. What is the cycle opens the grief so that the grief can be known rather than held, she said. Known and held are different relationships. Holding is carrying. Knowing is understanding. The cycle moves the griever from carrying to understanding. I have been carrying for 7 years, he said. I know, she said. The carrying was visible in the doorway on the first night. It is visible now. She paused. It is also lighter now than it was on the first night. Lighter, he said. The cycle does not remove grief, she said. Grief is not something that can be removed. The cycle makes the grief audible, gives it sound, gives it structure. The person hears their grief in the sound, and the hearing makes the grief a thing that exists outside them as well as inside them. The outside existence changes the carrying. It does not feel lighter, he said. It will, she said. Not tonight. The cycle's effect is cumulative. The hearing continues after the sound stops. The grief that was given sound continues to exist in the memory of the sound, and the memory continues the work. At the stone walls that led, eventually, to the stairs that led, eventually to the tomb where he went every Sunday, and where the alcove waited, and where Heloise was, and where the feelings he had locked lived. I go to the tomb, he said. Every Sunday, I sit with her. I know, she said. The household knows. The territory knows. The tomb holds the grief permanently, he said. You said places hold permanently, and songs hold temporarily. Yes. In 7 years. Permanent holding does not resolve, she said. Permanent holding preserves. The tomb preserves the grief the way it preserves the body. Intact. Unchanged. The same grief you locked there 7 years ago, maintained at the same temperature, in the same condition. And the song. The song does not preserve, she said. The song transforms. The grief enters the sound as one thing and exits the sound as another thing, known rather than carried, heard rather than held. She looked at the water in her glass. The tomb keeps the grief alive. The song lets the grief become something the griever can live with. He was quiet for a long time. Will you sing again? He said. The festival, he said. For me, the cycle, or parts of it, whatever the tradition allows. She looked at him. The specific assessment of a singer evaluating a request, not the institutional assessment of a subject evaluating a king's order, but the artistic assessment of a practitioner evaluating whether the request was real. The tradition allows the cycle to be sung for an individual, she said. The tradition was designed for individuals. The festival performance is the public version. The private version is different. The singer reads the griever and adjusts the forms to the specific grief being carried. The public cycle is general. The private cycle is precise. Precise, he said. I would need to know the grief, she said. Not the facts. I can hear the facts in the carrying. I would need to know the specific quality of what was lost. The love that produced the grief. The person who was gone. Heloise, he said. It was the first time he had said her name to anyone other than the tomb in 7 years. The name in the corridor had a different quality than the name in the tomb. The tomb's acoustics were stone and silence, and the name sounded there the way it always sounded, sealed and preserved and unchanged. The corridor's acoustics were air and light, and the name sounded different. Released, momentary, the specific quality of a word spoken into a space that would not hold it permanently. "Tell me about Heloise," she said. He told her. In the corridor, standing, with the festival's noise distant and the stone walls close and the specific quality of a conversation that was happening in the space between a tomb and a song. He told her about the marriage, 3 years, the specific compressed quality of a love that had been given insufficient time, and that had therefore existed at full intensity for every available moment. He told her about the death, sudden, medical, the specific kind of loss that did not provide the warning that other losses provided, and that therefore hit the full weight of the grief at once rather than in stages. He told her about the locking, the mirrors first, then the music, then the specific incremental removal of everything that triggered the grief, until the only trigger remaining was the tomb, and the tomb was the only place the grief was allowed to exist. She listened the way she sang, completely, with the specific immensity of someone whose capacity was larger than most people's capacity, and who applied the largeness to the receiving as well as the producing. "I can sing for Heloise," she said, "the private cycle, tailored to the specific grief you are carrying. Ready means willing to hear the grief rather than hold it." "I have been holding it for 7 years," he said. "I am ready to hear it." "That is a start," she said. "But hearing requires being in a room where the sound can reach you, and the room you have been in for 7 years is a tomb, and the tomb is designed to preserve rather than transform. You want me to not go to the tomb. I want you to come to a room that is designed for sound rather than stone," she said. "The gallery, the corridor, a room with air. The song requires air. The grief requires the song. The song requires air." Chapter 6. She sang for him on a Sunday. This was deliberate. The Sunday, the specific day he went to the tomb. She did not ask him to stop going. She asked him to come to the gallery first, before the tomb, to sit in the room where the sound could reach him, and to receive the private cycle before he descended the stairs. He came. The gallery was empty. Just the two of them, the north-facing windows producing the specific quality of light that the room was designed for. She stood at the center. He sat in the front row, because the back row was no longer the compromise his emotional capacity required. The front row was closer. Closer meant the sound reached him with less distance to dilute it. She sang. The private cycle was different from the public performance. The difference was in the specificity, the general grief of the public cycle replaced by the particular grief of a man whose wife had died suddenly, after 3 years of full-intensity love, and whose response had been to lock the grief in a tomb and visit it weekly and build his life around the locking. The first form held Heloise, not the general loss. Heloise specifically, the specific quality of her that Edric had described in the corridor, rendered in the old Galdenmere vocal tradition structure. The sound held her the way the tomb held her, but differently. The tomb held her body. The sound held her presence. The distinction was the thing that the cycle was designed to produce. He felt her, in the sound, in the specific quality of a voice that had taken his description and translated it into the old Galdenmere frequencies that the tradition had spent centuries developing for exactly this purpose. He felt Heloise in the room the way he felt her in the tomb, except the room was air and light, and the tomb was stone and dark, and the difference was that the room's version could breathe. The forms progressed. The anger, specific to his anger, the particular fury of a man who had been given 3 years when he should have been given 50. The guilt, his guilt, the specific quality of a man who had not been present when the death happened, and who had spent 7 years in the specific impossible calculation of whether presence would have changed the outcome. The memory, her memory, the specific Heloise that existed in his recollection and that the song held in sound so that the recollection could exist outside his head for the cycle's duration. The love. The fifth form, in the private cycle, was different. The public version held love. Generally, the private version held this love, Edric's love for Heloise, the specific 3-year full-intensity love that had produced the grief, rendered in sound, held in the voice of a woman who had listened to him describe it in a corridor, and who had found, in the description, the material for the song. The love in the sound was alive, not preserved. The tomb preserved the love the way it preserved the body, intact, unchanged, maintained at the same temperature. The song held the love alive, breathing, moving, the specific quality of a thing that existed in time rather than in stone. He heard the love, Not the grief. The love. Separated from the grief by the song's structure, held independently, audible independently, the specific experience of feeling the love without the automatic arrival of the grief that had been fused to it for 7 years. The seventh form, the quiet one. Him. In the private cycle, the seventh form was the most specific. The singer's reading of the griever, rendered in the sound that remained after the grief had been held and heard and known. The sound that said, "You are here. Underneath everything, you exist independently of the carrying." She sang him, the specific quality of a man who had been excellent at governance and absent at everything else. A man who had locked his heart in a tomb and visited it weekly, and who was now sitting in a gallery hearing the heart's contents in sound for the first time in 7 years. The song ended. The silence held. "Go to the tomb now," she said. "If you want to." He sat in the gallery. He looked at the door that led to the corridor that led to the stairs that led to the tomb. He looked at the room he was in, the air, the light, the sound's residue. "Not today," he said. She looked at him. The specific quality of the looking, not the assessment anymore, but the particular warmth of a person who had just held a man's grief in her voice for 90 minutes, and who had found, in the holding, that the man's grief was not the only thing she was holding. "Not today," she repeated. "The tomb will be there next Sunday," he said. "Heloise will be there. The alcove will be there." He looked at the gallery's north-facing windows. "Today, I want to be in a room with air." Chapter 7. He did not stop going to the tomb. This was important. The tomb was Heloise's place, and the visiting was his practice, and the practice was a thing he was not willing to surrender. But the visiting changed. The specific quality of the Sunday hour changed. Not the duration, not the frequency, but the content. The content, which had been the locked grief, preserved and maintained and unchanged for 7 years, was now the known grief, heard and transformed indifferent. He sat in the tomb, and he felt Heloise, and the feeling was not the same as it had been before the cycle. The feeling was known. The grief had been given sound, and the sound had changed the grief's quality from the thing he carried to the thing he understood, and the understanding did not remove the grief, but gave the grief a shape he could hold without the holding consuming him. Tova sang for him every Sunday before the tomb. This became their practice. The gallery in the morning, the cycle or parts of it, the specific private performance that the tradition allowed. She tailored each session to what she read in his carrying. Some Sundays the loss form, some Sundays the love form, some Sundays the seventh form, the quiet one, the one that held him. They talked after the singing. In the gallery, in the specific quality of a room that had just held sound and that carried the sound's residue the way the corridor had carried her voice on the first night. They talked about Heloise. They talked about the tomb. They talked about the specific process of a grief that was being transformed from carried to known, and that was, in the transforming, making space. Space was the thing he had not expected. The tomb had taken up the space, the locked grief occupying the interior, the sealed chambers filled with the feelings that had been placed there. The singing was creating space. Not by removing the grief remained, was always going to remain. By changing the grief's relationship to the interior. The grief known and heard occupied the interior differently than the grief locked and preserved. Known grief was present but not consuming. Known grief left room. Room for what? He did not know yet. The room existed. The room was new. The newness was the specific evidence that the singing was working. "You are different," Cyrus said, on a morning in early spring. The steward's assessment, delivered with the professional directness of a man who had been watching for 7 years, and who recognized change when it appeared. "Different how?" Edric said. "Present," Cyrus said, in a way that has not been the case. He paused. The singer, Edric confirmed. "The household has noticed." "The household may notice." Cyrus looked at him with the specific assessment of a steward evaluating a change and finding it favorable. "She is still in the East Gallery." "She is still singing," Edric said. "Every Sunday, the old Galdenmere lament cycle." "Every Sunday," Cyrus said. "Before the tomb. Before the tomb." "The tomb visits are shorter," Cyrus said. "The household has noted this as well." "The tomb visits are different," Edric said. "The duration is secondary to the quality." Cyrus was quiet for a moment. "Is the quality better?" Edric looked at the window, at the spring light that was arriving in the specific way that spring light arrived in the Galdenmere territory, slowly, reluctantly. The particular quality of light that had been absent for the winter's duration, and that returned with the specific caution of something that was not sure it was wanted. The quality is known, Edric said. The grief is known rather than held. The difference is significant. Epilogue, on a Sunday in late spring, he went to the tomb after the singing. The tomb was the same. Stone, dark, the specific sealed quality of a space designed to hold things permanently. Heloise's alcove, his alcove, the empty one, the reservation he had made at 27. He sat in the tomb, and he felt the grief, and the grief was known. Heard. Transformed by 6 months of a voice that held it in sound so that he could hear it rather than carry it. He looked at the empty alcove. His alcove, the space he had reserved for the future he had intended, the future that was the tomb, the permanent holding, the specific sealed conclusion of a life organized around the absence. He looked at it for a long time. Then he stood. He went up the stairs. He went to the gallery where Tova was still present. She stayed after the singing now, the specific practice of a woman who had found that the after-singing was as important as the singing, and who was not willing to leave the room before the room's work was done. She was sitting in the front row, reading a collection of old Galdenmere texts, the specific preserved record of the tradition she was the last practitioner of. She looked up when he came in. "The tomb," she said. "The alcove is the same. Heloise is the same. And you." He sat beside her, in the front row. The specific position of a man who had moved from the doorway to the back row to the front row over the course of 6 months, the particular geographic evidence of a man crossing a threshold 1 row at a time. "I am not going to use the alcove," he said. She looked at him. "The empty one," he said. "I made it at 27 because I believed the tomb was the only future that made sense. I have believed that for 7 years. He looked at the gallery's north-facing windows. "The tomb holds permanently. The song holds temporarily. I have been living in the permanent holding, and I do not want to live there anymore." "What do you want?" she said. "Air," he said. "Light, sound, the specific quality of a room where grief is known rather than preserved. The specific quality of a voice that holds the grief so that the person underneath it can breathe." At the woman whose voice was immense and whose presence was quiet, and who had spent 6 months holding his grief in sound, and who had, in the holding, shown him that the grief was not the only thing inside him, that underneath the grief was a man, that the man could exist in rooms with air, that the existence was not a betrayal of the woman in the tomb, but a continuation of the love that had produced the grief. "The tradition," he said, "the old Galdenmere vocal tradition, it is critically endangered." "I am the last practitioner," she said. "The tradition saved me," he said. The tradition reached into a locked tomb and produced the key, and the key was sound. He held her gaze. "The tradition should not be the last of anything. You want to preserve the tradition," he said. "A school, students, the specific institutional support that ensures the tradition continues beyond you. The territory owes the tradition that. I owe the tradition that." She looked at the texts in her lap, at the preserved record of the tradition she carried alone. "A school," she said. "In the stronghold," he said, "where the gallery has the acoustics, where the tradition can be taught, where the songs can be learned by people who will carry them forward. That is," she paused, "that is the most significant thing anyone has offered the tradition in 3 generations. The tradition offered me something significant first," he said. She looked at him. The specific quality of the looking had changed over 6 months, not the assessment of a singer reading a griever, but the particular quality of a woman who had been holding a man's grief for 6 months, and who had found, in the holding, that the thing she was holding had changed, and the change had produced something she had not anticipated. "The school would require me to stay," she said. "The school would require you to stay," he confirmed. "In the stronghold. In the stronghold." At the north-facing windows and the specific quality of light that the room produced, and the acoustic space that the architecture provided, and the particular geography of a room where a man had been taken apart by a song and put back together by the singer. "I'll stay," she said. He reached for her hand. She gave it, the hand that produced the immensity, the hand that had held his grief in sound, the hand of the last practitioner of a tradition that had been designed, over centuries, for exactly what it had done. The gallery held them. The air held them. The specific quality of a room designed for sound held the 2 people who had been changed by the sound, the man whose grief had been transformed from carried to known, and the woman whose voice had done the transforming. The tomb was downstairs. The tomb held Heloise. The tomb held the grief in its permanent way, in its stone and its dark and its sealed quality. The gallery was here. The gallery held air and light and the residue of 6 months of singing. The gallery held the specific quality of a man who had learned, through the oldest tradition in his territory, that the love and the grief were the same material, and that the material could be known rather than locked, and that the knowing made the living possible. The alcove would remain empty. The gallery would remain full. The song was the difference. It had always been the difference. The tradition knew.